Welcome to Celts Unveiled, a captivating journey back in time that invites you to explore the enigmatic world of the ancient Celts. In this documentary, we embark on a quest to unravel the rich tapestry of Celtic culture, traversing the mists of time to understand the origins, beliefs, and profound impact of this remarkable civilization. As we navigate the historical currents, we'll explore the Celtic expansion, their encounters with neighboring civilizations, and the enduring legacy that survives to this day. Celts Unveiled is more than a documentary. It's an odyssey through time, a celebration of a people whose story, though ancient, resonates in the present. So, fasten your seatbelts as we embark on this immersive exploration of the ancient Celts, and together, let's unravel the mysteries of this extraordinary civilization. The ancient Celts were various tribal groups living in parts of Western and Central Europe in the Late Bronze Age and through the Iron Age, circa 700 before the Common Era to circa 400 Common Era. Given the name Celts by ancient writers, these tribes and their culture migrated, and so they established a presence in territories from Portugal to Turkey. Although diverse tribes and never a single unified state, the ancient Celts were connected by the Celtic language and marked similarities in art, modes of warfare, religion, and burial practices. Although the Celtic culture was absorbed within the Roman Empire from the 1st century before the Common Era, Celtic people continued to thrive in more remote parts of Europe like Ireland and northern Britain, where Celtic languages are still spoken today. The term Celts is commonly used to refer to peoples who lived in Iron Age Europe north of the Mediterranean region prior to the Roman conquest, after ancient writers gave them that name. However, it is a problematic label. This is because these peoples were not part of a unified state but, rather, belonged to a multitude of tribes, many of which had no direct contact with each other. The term remains useful for its convenience, but it does disguise the complex relations between different Western and Central European tribes, the overlapping of some cultural features in time and space, and the isolation and uniqueness of other such features. The European Iron Age was certainly a vibrant period of cultural interaction, trade relations, warfare, and migrations. Most scholars agree that the origins of Celtic culture can be traced back to 3 earlier, closely related, and overlapping cultural groups. The first of these is the Late Bronze Age Urnfield culture present around the Upper Danube from circa 1300 before the Common Era. The name of this culture derives from the common practice of interring the cremated remains of the deceased in urns and burying them. These peoples remain obscure for lack of archaeological evidence. From the beginning of the first millennium before the Common Era and over the next 2 or 3 centuries, ironworking technology spread across Europe. As a consequence, iron replaced bronze as the metal of choice to make stronger and more durable tools and weapons. The second Proto-Celtic group was the Hallstatt culture, named after the site of that name in Upper Austria, which existed from circa 1200 to circa 450 before the Common Era but was at its peak in the 8th to 6th century before the Common Era. The Hallstatt culture spread to cover what is today Western Austria, southern Germany, Switzerland, and eastern France on the one side, and eastern Austria, Bohemia, and parts of the Balkans on the other. It was the western side of this area that would eventually develop into what we might today call the ancient Celts. The Hallstatt culture likely spread via various means such as trade, tribal alliances, intermarriages, imitation, and migration. These peoples prospered thanks to local deposits of salt, iron, and copper, commodities which could be traded along waterways. That trade reached as far south as the Mediterranean cultures, the Etruscans in Italy and the Greek colonies in southern France, is evidenced by the presence of imported goods in Hallstatt burial mounds and precious goods such as gold and amber jewelry. The Hallstatt culture went into decline in the 5th century before the Common Era, likely due to local resources running out, increased tribal competition, and the shift of trade routes elsewhere. The third group significant in the formation of Celtic culture proper is the Latène culture, circa 450 circa 50 before the Common Era, named after the site of that name on the northern shores of Lake Neuchâtel in Switzerland. Perhaps best identified as a group of diverse tribes unified by common features in art and religion, The Latène culture was eventually present in a wide arc covering Western and Central Europe, spanning from Ireland to Romania. Cultural features include ironworking, making votive offerings in water sources, depositing weapons in tombs, and art which is stylized with swirling, geometrical, and vegetal designs. Once again, there is a multitude of evidence for trade with the Mediterranean states. Latène centers were particularly successful around major river points such as the Loire, Marne, Moselle, and Elbe. The Latène culture does not exactly correspond to the Celtic peoples since it existed in non-Celtic areas, for example in Germanic-speaking Denmark. Nevertheless, the term Latène, one originally coined by archaeologists to classify artifacts, is still commonly, if imprecisely, used as a synonym for Celtic culture in Europe during the second half of the first millennium before the Common Era. One of the striking points of connection between many of the peoples of Iron Age Europe is their common language, Celtic. The Celtic language is a branch of the Indo-European language family. Scholars have divided Celtic languages into two groups, Insular Celtic and Continental Celtic. The latter group was no longer widely spoken after the Roman imperial period, and, unfortunately, the only surviving examples of it are mentions in the works of Greek and Roman writers and some short epigraphic remains such as pottery graffiti and votive and funerary stelae. The best documented of this group is Gaulish. The insular Celtic group of languages are two: British or Brittonic, Breton, Cornish, and Welsh, and Goidelic, Irish and its medieval derivatives, Scots Gaelic, and Manx. Brittonic was spoken in all of Britain in the Roman period. From it evolved Cumbrian, extinct since medieval times, Cornish, no longer spoken after the 18th century Common Era but recently revived, Breton, likely introduced by 5th century Common Era British settlers and not connected directly to Gaulish, and Welsh, which is still spoken today. The earliest evidence of Goidelic Irish dates to the 5th century Common Era, and it later evolved into Middle Irish, circa 950–1200 Common Era, and, thereafter, morphed again into Modern Irish, which is still spoken today. The second common characteristic of those people we call Ancient Celts is their religion. This was a polytheistic religion with a multitude of gods, although our knowledge of them is limited to classical authors given the lack of written works by the Celts themselves. Variations existed across regions in the centuries, but common features of. With Druids loath to commit their knowledge to writing, there are no surviving sacred texts, hymns, or prayers for the Celtic religion. Key gods were given all-embracing powers or characteristics, and these include Cernunnos, the horned god, who likely represented nature and fertility. Another major figure is Lugus, known as Lu in later periods, perhaps the only universally worshipped god in the Celtic world, who represented the sun and who was regarded as all-wise and all-seeing. There were many female goddesses associated with healing springs and rivers such as Sequana, a personification of the river Seine, and Epona, who was linked with horses. An unusual feature of Celtic gods was that some were viewed as a trio, perhaps representing three different aspects of the same divinity. One trinity example is the three mother goddesses, the matronae, who represent individually the similar concepts of strength, power, and fertility. Of the numerous local and regional gods, many were associated with those things of primary concern to everyday life such as warfare, sovereignty, tribal identity, healing, hunting, and the protection of specific groups like mothers and children. There was a Greek and Roman influence on the Celtic religion from the 2nd century before the Common Era when Celtic sacred sites, which had previously been mere clearings surrounded by earthworks, began to use larger stone temples. So, too, some Greco-Roman gods were incorporated into the Celtic pantheon. Once again, without first-hand written records, it is difficult to reconstruct the intricacies of ancient Celtic society. Nevertheless, we do know that society in many Celtic tribes was hierarchical. At the top were rulers and elite warriors. Then there were the religious leaders and repositories of the community's collected knowledge, the Druids, who were exempt from taxes and military service. Then there were specialized craft workers, traders, slaves, and farmers. the largest group by far in societies that were rural and agrarian. Celtic societies were led first by monarchs and then by elected chiefs or, alternatively, a small council of elders. Over time, many tribes joined together for mutual assistance or became dependent on another, more powerful one, and so paid some kind of tribute. By the end of the period, there were large confederations of tribes, joined to meet the common threat from the Romans. We know that some women were chiefs in Celtic Britain, for example, Cartimandua, ruler of the Brigantes tribe in the north of England in the mid-1st century Common Era, and Boudica, d. 61 Common Era, queen of the Iceni tribe, who led a revolt of several tribes against the Roman occupation in 60 Common Era. There is also evidence that some women were treated as equally as men in terms of burial with precious goods. For example, in the 6th–5th century before the Common Era Vix burial near Châtillon-sur-Seine in northeast France. There was a strong kinship system where rulers and their extended family dominated the society through their ownership of land and revenue from trade. Rulers maintained the loyalty of their followers through gift-giving, organizing Celtic feasts, and social display. Ties were reinforced between families by fostering children with other aristocratic families, a method also used to bind different tribes together in alliances. There was also a system where the elite undertook the welfare and protection of those who gave some sort of service in return, much like feudalism in the Middle Ages. Except for slaves, there is no evidence of any barriers for the child of one of the social groups to eventually enter another group provided they acquired the necessary wealth, through valor in war, for example, or went through the required education or apprenticeship, which for a Druid lasted some 20 years. Julius Caesar, circa 100–44 before the Common Era, noted in his Gallic Wars that Celtic women in Gaul brought to their husbands a dowry and that this could be inherited by the woman if her partner died before her. Caesar also noted that husbands had the power of life and death over their wives and their children. Whether these assessments are accurate and whether they applied to Celts elsewhere is much debated by scholars. Alongside language and religious practices, another common feature of Celts throughout Europe is the art they produced. Celtic art was influenced by that of the earlier indigenous Iron Age cultures mentioned above and by neighboring cultures or trading partners like the Thracians, Scythians, Greeks, Etruscans, and Romans, and through these peoples, ideas from the Near East. Materials used include pottery, stone, iron, bronze, and gold, with extra decoration achieved using imported exotic materials like glass, coral, and amber. Metals were cast, engraved, punched, traced, inlaid, and worked on using repoussé, grooving the material from behind to create a relief on the other side. Typical art objects include ornate cauldrons, sandstone or wooden human figures, Celtic bronze shields, gold torques, penannular brooches, composed of a pin and ring, and animal figurines to be used as votive offerings. As noted above, the Proto-Celtic cultures in Western and Central Europe had already established trade links with the Mediterranean cultures, and this continued with the Celts. Tin from Britain, amber from the Baltic, and horses from Eastern Europe and the Balkans were also imported and used or passed on southwards. Celtic resources which were traded included salt, slaves, iron, gold, wool cloth, and furs. These goods were exchanged for wine, in huge quantities, silver, luxury manufactured goods, like bronze flagons, fine Greek pottery, and Etruscan bronze craters, silk, and the precious materials for use in art objects and jewelry mentioned in the previous section. Trade had secondary consequences besides giving access to scarce resources. Ideas in art, religion, and technology were passed on. The Celts adopted flat grave burials and minted their own coins, for example. There was, too, an increase in the competition between Celtic tribes to acquire the resources needed for trade. The Celtic world was expanding its horizons, and the creation of an ever-growing rich elite would have consequences for the wider continent as the Celts began to enviously eye the very heartlands of their rich trading partners and vice versa. That warfare was a major part of Celtic culture is clear from the number of gods in the ancient Celtic pantheon associated with war and the great number of weapons deposited in tombs. Courage and prowess on the battlefield were also important in determining status within society. Celtic warriors in Gaul are described as bleaching their long hair using lime water, while in Britain, they painted designs on their bodies. Several classical authors also comment on the strange fact that Celtic warriors could enter battle naked and that they collected the heads of their victims. Many Celtic warriors wore a torque necklace, and these were likely a symbol of status and rank within the community. There is evidence that Celtic women participated in warfare. Celtic warriors used spears, long swords, and distinctive large rectangular or oval shields. Celtic armies employed slingers, chariots, and cavalry, while organization on the battlefield was achieved through the use of standards and war horns. Celtic armies did cause quite a few problems for their neighbors from the 4th century before the Common Era onwards as tribes moved west, south, and eastwards in waves to find new wealth opportunities in what is sometimes called the Celtic migration. Brennus, chief of the Gallic Senones tribe, famously sacked Rome in 390 before the Common Era, and the Celts again caused havoc when they looted Delphi in 279 before the Common Era as they passed through Greece on their way to Asia, where they became known as the Galatians. The Celtic collection of tribes attacked the Romans again in 225 before the Common Era and were frequent mercenary allies of Carthage during the Punic Wars, 264 to 146 before the Common Era. In the longer term, though, Celtic armies were no match for more disciplined and better equipped enemies like the Hellenistic kingdoms and the Romans in large-scale battles. However, once conquered, Celtic warriors, who had always been recognized for their bravery, did subsequently fight successfully as mercenaries in many Greek and Roman armies. The first real sign of trouble in the Celtic world was a marked increase in local competition for resources and trade opportunities, and this manifested itself in the building of oppida in the 2nd and 1st century before the Common Era. An oppidum was the Roman name for larger settlements which we now apply specifically to fortified sites, usually located on high points in the landscape or on plains at naturally defensible points like river bends. The fortifications usually consisted of an earthworks circuit wall, sometimes with outer ditches. Oppida were used as a point of refuge in war and otherwise as a safe place to concentrate manufacturing workshops and store the community's resources. This hostile environment deteriorated further when the Romans became intent on revenge for the havoc caused by the migrating Celtic tribes in the 2 previous centuries and, lured by the promise of gold and other resources, total conquest. In 125 before the Common Era, the Romans attacked the Arverni tribe in Gaul and, less than a century later, Julius Caesar attacked and conquered Gaul, despite stiff resistance from such tribal leaders as Vercingetorix, 82 to 46 before the Common Era. The Roman Empire kept on expanding. Direct attacks were made on such important community figures as the Druids, and so the continental Celts and those in southern Britain were eventually assimilated into Roman culture. The Celts did continue to thrive in more isolated places like Ireland and northern Britain. It is from these areas that Celtic culture would continue into the medieval period and express itself most visibly in the epic poems of Irish, Welsh, and Scottish medieval literature and in art, now Christianized. The old Celtic traditions lived on in these epic poems and in the form of complex curvilinear designs within illuminated manuscripts, in the ubiquitous penannular brooches, and in the sophisticated vegetal motifs on imposing stone crosses in churchyards. In conclusion, Celts Unveiled has been a voyage through time, a pilgrimage to the heart of an ancient civilization that, despite the eons that separate us, remains ever present in the tapestry of our shared heritage. The ancient Celts, with their complexity, creativity, and resilience, invite us not only to look backward but to draw inspiration for the challenges and opportunities of our own age. Their legacy, like the echoes of distant thunder, continues to resound, urging us to cherish our cultural diversity, celebrate our shared humanity, and honor the timeless wisdom of those who came before us. So, as we bid farewell to the ancient Celts, let us carry forward their flame, allowing it to illuminate the path ahead and guide us into the future with a deeper understanding of the intricate tapestry that binds us all.